Former Bank of Canada Governor David Dodge, they're weighing in on the growing group of premiers who are pleading with the current governor of the bank, Tiff Macklem, to press pause on interest rate hikes. The latest premier, Newfoundland and Labrador's Andrew Furey, joins Ontario's Doug Ford and BC's David Eby in asking Macklem to more fully consider the negative impacts on Canadians of 10 successive rate hikes in 18 months. Let's bring back the front bench, Brian Gallant, Lisa Raitt, Tom Mulcair, and Judy Trinh to talk about that. Brian, I'll start off with you as a former premier. Do you agree with the assessment that it's a bit of grandstanding, or would you also be writing a letter right now to the premier, to the Bank of Canada governor if you were still premier?
It's a bit of grandstanding. I mean, it's a bit of positioning. It's showing to the people of their respective provinces that they are doing anything and everything that they can to help with the rising costs that families are feeling across the country. So it's a way to do that with really no kind of consequences or repercussions, and frankly, you could argue without any impact. I don't think the Bank of Canada is going to say, okay, a few premiers think that we have to pause, so let's pause. I believe, though, that they probably should pause, my personal opinion. So from that perspective, weighing in on the public policy debate is something that a premier and elected official can certainly do, but I think that they're all doing it knowing that that's not really going to have an impact. The mild impact that it does have, though, we're talking about it, so it does participate in the discourse. So nothing wrong with that, I suppose. But all three of them would know, and any other premiers that would kind of step up and do this would know that it's a way to sort of get a highlight in the news, get a headline in your local media, maybe national, and it's clear that you're fighting for the rising costs with really, again, not something that you're going to have actually have responsibility for. And even if they do pause or they don't pause, you're not going to have any repercussions or consequences on the position that you took on that. Whereas other things, when you take a position, if it ends up being maybe the wrong one or perceived wrong one, there can be a backlash. I
think, Judy, the cynic in me also is wondering, look, people in all of those provinces and the rest of them are really living under a lot of stress right now with the cost of living crisis. And this kind of pushes their eyeballs to another target, right? Not to say that any one of those premiers is specifically, to blame for everything, but certainly some of their policies have been under criticism as well as, potentially leading to cost of living issues. And this, I would imagine, helps move those eyeballs, even if temporarily.
That's right, Vassy. So it'll be interesting to see whether or not Tiff Macklem even addresses the premier's letters tomorrow.
He does not like to wade into politics.
No, he does not. But you know what he does have to pay attention to? He has to pay attention to growing consumer debt. We know that Canadians have the most debt of all G7 countries. We know that from the Leger post last week, Leger survey last week, that 47% of Canadians are living paycheck to paycheck, along with the fact that the majority of this group are all above the age of 18. So 18 to 35. I just want to point out that the Bank of Canada is stuck between a rock and a hard place, right? This is what they're going to have to assess. When I visited a restaurant last week, and at this restaurant, it's very much a microcosm of what is going on across Canada. So in this restaurant, it's called Hometown Sports Grill here in Ottawa. What he said was, the owner told me that basically his customers were not spending as much money, and they were telling him that was because they were having difficulties making their mortgage payments. They used to come in 4 times a month. Now they might come in once. Because of higher food costs, he is forced to basically raise the price of wings, the price of fries. So these low-cost items usually. And what is he doing? Trying to draw the customers. But at the same time, if he raises prices, what's going to happen? He's going to drive customers away. At the same time, he employs a bunch of young people. I spoke to a young woman who is 21 years old who has to take 2 jobs in order to pay her rent, in order to pay her gas bill. So people are suffering. And I think Tiff Macklem has he has acknowledged that, but he's also said that, it is not the responsibility of the Bank of Canada to deal with housing prices, to deal with the housing crisis.
Well, I mean, they have a very narrow mandate, right?
That's right.
Which is to tackle the rate of inflation. Just sort of emblematic of what Judy's talking about, I think is what's behind the political imperative, right, for Tom, all these premiers to be weighing in right now. I'm wondering if, from where you sit, it changes the calculation at all for how the federal government navigates the issue of the Bank of Canada from a communications perspective, right? It was a real cleavage between them and the Conservatives when Pierre Poilievre was saying that the Bank of Canada's governor should be fired. But now he's far from the only politician weighing in on this independent institution. Does that, do you think, change how the feds end up navigating this, at least from a communications perspective?
It really does, and I think that's a great point, because you go to the left, and out on the west coast, you've got David Eby, the NDP Premier of British Columbia, pushing. You've got someone on the right wing, Doug Ford of Ontario, and you've got the last man standing of the Liberal premiers out in Newfoundland, Labrador, joining the fray. And, you know, there's a doctrinaire answer to whether or not anybody should interfere, but this isn't interference. This is part of the context in which a decision has to be taken. It's not sacrosanct that no one can have an opinion or express one about what the Bank of Canada should or shouldn't do. So expressing the concerns for the average family in your province, that's healthy. And of course, they're not going to reference those letters in their decision, but it doesn't mean they're not going to take it into account. And if it were really on a knife's edge, maybe it would have an effect of bringing it on the side of prudence and not having a rate hike. I don't think that a rate hike was actually in the works. So to go to your earliest point, I think, Vassy, there is a bit of politics involved in this, but nothing surprising. The political season has started again. That's why we get to talk together again.
Very true. Lisa, what are your thoughts on that?
So I think that the Bank of Canada's hands are tied. They only have a certain amount of tools they can use. They have a very narrow mandate, as you pointed out, Vassy. And the premiers are saying, look, folks, affordability, it's a big deal and people are suffering. So if I were the governor of the Bank of Canada, I would say, okay, I understand where you're coming from, but really, you know, talk to the people who set my mandate, and that's the federal government. So the Liberal government is going to eventually, this whole situation will make its way back up to them because they're the one that sets the mandate and the policy. Should we be sitting at 3%? Maybe 4% makes a lot more sense. Maybe they need a little bit more room in their mandate. But Bank of Canada, Tiff Macklem's hands are tied. And I will tell you anecdotally, I was at a lunch today with bankers, and boy, when you hear about politics coming into play with respect to decisions by the Bank of Canada, they are not happy people. They do not want to see this crossover of politics and what Bank of Canada decides to do.
Might be past, Brian, the point of no return, right? Just given the sort of cross-section of politicians who are weighing in on it, short, you know, beyond just calling for the Bank of Canada governor to be fired. Just jumping off what Lisa said, though, quickly, this idea that the feds, or there might be a wider discussion on either changing the mandate, or I'm thinking of Premier Fury's letter, where he asks basically alternatives to raising interest rates, along with new approaches to improving affordability and inflation, should be considered that are not at the detriment of Canadians. They're desperately needed, he said. Do you think that discussion will be broached, given what's been experienced over the last 18 months?
I think it's very possible that it will be broached. If ever there were a change of government, certainly we have one political leader on the federal scene that has made it very clear that it takes no issue sort of going after the bank, and I'm sure would be keen to sort of bring in a suite of changes that would give, to Lisa's point, more tools, but also sort of demonstrate that he's putting the hammer down on who many are starting to blame for inflation, which I don't think is fair, but nevertheless. And yeah, to your point, I mean, 3 different political parties on the premier level sort of saying it kind of softens the idea that this is some type of polarized partisan issue, and it's just a bunch of different politicians from different political parties that take issue with the bank's approach, the Bank of Canada's approach. So certainly it opens up, I think, people to have that type of discussion. Hopefully, to Lisa's point, not from a political angle, but more for a very public policy-oriented angle. I
wonder, though, if the Liberals federally, Tom, are prepared to go there. And I guess why I brought it up is because I think of the many instances in which specifically the finance minister, Chrystia Freeland, has said over and over, like, we don't get involved in monetary policy. That's their job. We're just trying not to make their job any harder than it has to be.
Well, I go back to that disastrous press conference right after that cabinet retreat in Prince Edward Island, where every sentence began with, well, we're going to continue doing what we're doing, but then we'll try maybe this or that. And on the key issue of housing, they came up empty. And people decoded that. I think that there's some very smart people in charge of communications for the Liberal Party and at the Prime Minister's office. They're saying, okay, we've got to find something else to hit on our dashboard, because there's still lots of red flashing lights and the public's not happy with it. So I do believe, Vassy, that they will go down the type of path that's being described by Premier Furey, and don't forget, he is the last remaining Liberal Premier. I wouldn't be surprised if there was a little bit of communication between the two. So this is the type of positive thing, something constructive and concrete that Trudeau can put on the table when he comes back from this most recent trip. If he does that, he might start finding a way out of the very, very thick forest that he's been in on these affordability issues since the beginning of the summer.
Last word to you, Lisa. Do they have to tread lightly, though, given what you just said about the reception the banks are having to this idea of politicians wading in?
There's one thing to try to tell the Bank of Canada what to do and what not to do, but it is really in the purview of a government to set mandate for the Bank of Canada. And that is something that can be debated and should be looked into. Quite frankly, what it comes down to at the end of the day, Vassy, is this. Do you believe this is a crisis or do you not believe it's a crisis? If you believe it's a crisis, you're going to behave as if it is one, and you're going to have extraordinary measures in order to deal with affordability. If you do not think it's a real crisis, you're going to do what Tom just said they're going to do, which is not really have a lot of response.
My guess is, I think I have 2 seconds, Judy, but that there's hardly a politician who would not admit things are at a crisis level right now.
Things are at a crisis level, and they want to be able to blame it on the Bank of Canada, or at least defer some responsibility, right? But I think it is my guess is that the Bank of Canada could potentially hold the interest rate, but not because of letters from premiers, but because of growing consumer debt. Tiff Macklem had flagged that was an issue when he made his last hike in June, and he said they were watching it closely, and the situation has only gotten worse since then.
Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for a great discussion. Appreciate it. Great to see everyone again. Brian Gallant, Judy Trin, Lisa Raitt, and Tom Mulcahy.